Hello, welcome to Property Point. I'm joined as always by Nerida Conisbee from REA Group. Hi Nerida.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Nerida, I wanted to talk about an Infrastructure Australia report that's just come out. It's saying that particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, there's going to be very strong population growth over the next 10 or 12 years or so. About 2 million people in each city, which is a massive increase in population. But of course, for the property market, that means that there's going to be strong demand for properties, and secondly, it's going to put a lot of stress on infrastructure in those cities and obviously around Australia.
Yeah, look, I mean, it is a big challenge for cities when they grow very rapidly. And if we have a look at Melbourne and Sydney, they're already very, very big cities. They're already cities that are really grappling with congestion. We did a report last year where we looked at the Australia's most livable suburbs, and so obviously the EIU produced a report where Melbourne always comes out on top. You know, it's always been seen as the world's most livable city. But we looked at suburb level data, and we looked at things that really drive popularity of suburbs. So things like good retailing, good public transport, good schools, those sorts of things. And it's really interesting. We also looked at congestion though. So congestion was the one that really changed the ranking of suburbs around Australia. So Melbourne continues to feature very strongly, but we started to see a lot of Brisbane suburbs pop up in the top most livable suburbs in Australia, and it was all down to congestion. Melbourne is a growing city, it's a big city, but it is now starting to struggle a lot with congestion and getting around the city. You know, public transport's very overcrowded in places. If you go to schools in inner city areas, they can be overcrowded as well. So, you know, there are a lot of challenges that go with a growing city.
Yeah, absolutely. And what, in terms of the property market itself, in particularly Melbourne and Sydney, but you know other states which are going to experience growth as a result of increased population growth. What's that going to do in terms of the property markets? I suppose we're going to see more decentralisation. Is that likely?
Yeah, look, it is likely. I mean, we're already seeing it a lot in Sydney, that places like Central Coast and Wollongong do seem to be benefiting from problems in Sydney, primarily around pricing. Sydney's answer to this is to create three separate cities, so really pushing out west, and you know that makes a lot of sense. The problem with Sydney and Melbourne is that the employment hubs are very centrally located. So if you can try and decentralise employment, it makes a lot of sense. So you know, Parramatta starts to see more employment growth. If we can get more employment growth out at the Western Sydney airport locations, you know, that really starts to make sense. If you're living in Penrith, you don't need to travel several hours to get into Sydney CBD. You can, you know, travel a lot less. So, you know, that's Sydney's answer. Melbourne, you know, hasn't got to that level yet. I mean, Melbourne is a city that is a bit easier to get around. It's flatter. There's fewer waterways. But you know, places like Geelong and Ballarat, longer term, will really benefit. And but again, it comes down to infrastructure. We know Geelong, for example, is far more popular than Ballarat, particularly with first home buyers, because they can get on the train and get into the Melbourne CBD in under an hour. So Ballarat's still over that hour. So there is kind of this tipping point where if you can get into the city in an hour, that's great. But over an hour, you do start to see people back off a little bit in terms of locations.
And in terms of property prices, obviously increased population increases demand, especially for inner city properties. So even though we're seeing a lull in the property market now, do you expect that will improve over time?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is jobs growth that really drives it. I mean, you can't build a wall around a city and tell people they can't move into it. So, you know, with Sydney, for example, following the GFC, we really didn't see prices move for about 5 years. And it was because Sydney wasn't really creating any jobs. Once those jobs were created, you know, we did see that surge in people moving to Sydney, and then price growth really came off the back of that. So, you know, as long as our economy continues to grow, which, you know, it certainly looks like it is doing pretty well at the moment, we're starting to see some really positive signs. It does put pressure on, it creates jobs, but then it also puts pressure on housing as well.
So there's a glimmer of hope there for investors, I suppose, over the medium term that, you know, the demand in the cities is going to remain and grow, and that's obviously good for housing prices.
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, there's always a natural cap as to what people are prepared to pay, and we see that investors are very focused on a sub 750,000 price point. When you go to Sydney at the moment, Sydney's seen great capital growth, but it's often too high for an investor to get into. So, I think longer term, Australia is a great place to invest. It's a very attractive country to be in. It's got a pretty stable government. I mean, I know we don't think so all the time, but compared to a lot of other countries, particularly the US and UK at the moment, our governance is pretty stable. So there's a lot of long-term drivers that make Australia a great place to invest, and also supports housing as well.
Oh, thanks very much, Nerida.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on Property Point.